Hello, fight fans. I'm that boxing writer, Jeremy C. Harridges, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video and visit my YouTube channel. This is a whole new experience for me. I'm still figuring out exactly what it is that I'm doing. All I know is that I want to have a chance to talk to fellow fight fans, hear what you have to say, and I want your input in my work. As you may or may not know, I'm the lead boxing contributor for Fansided.com, and I want to hear the questions that you guys want to ask the fighters. I'm talking to fighters all the time, and I'm hoping that I can bring them one step closer to you. I also want to give a big thank you to everybody that's helped support me in this early adventure into YouTube. Thank you for giving me a shot and taking a look at some of my videos. There's not a whole lot going on right now in the world of boxing. This has actually been a pretty quiet week, at least by my standards. I thought this was a great time to revisit something that intrigued me a while back. I was going through my Twitter timeline and I saw that George Foreman came out with his top 10 greatest heavyweights of all time. I went through it, read it a couple times, and I said, man, I'd love to talk to George about his top 10 list sometime. Well, I don't have George with me right here, but I am going to make some comments in reference to George's top 10 list. And I have my own top 10 list, which I did on behalf of Fansided about 1 year ago. I thought it would be fun to compare my top 10 greatest heavyweights list to George Foreman's top 10 greatest heavyweights list. I just brought up George Foreman's all-time heavyweight list. Here's who he has. He's got Joe Louis at 1, Rocky Marciano at 2, John L. Sullivan 3, Jack Johnson 4, Muhammad Ali 5, Floyd Patterson 6, Lennox Lewis 7, Mike Tyson 8, Evander Holyfield 9, and Jack Dempsey at 10. So that's his list. My list from 1 year ago on Fansided. I had Muhammad Ali 1, Joe Louis 2, Rocky Marciano 3, Gene Tunney 4, James J. Jeffries 5, George Foreman 6, Jack Dempsey 7, Lennox Lewis 8, Joe Frazier 9, Mike Tyson 10. So those are our two lists, and you can put them side to side. You can take a look at them and see what you think. And before I start critiquing anything on George Foreman's list, I want to say that George Foreman is one of my all-time favorite fighters. I've got tremendous respect for George Foreman and everything that he's done throughout his career. As you can see, I rated him as one of my top 10 greatest heavyweights of all time. I think it's very classy that George didn't include himself on his own list. That shows you the humble type of guy that George Foreman is. And I think there's a lot of reasons to really love George Foreman. And I think the boxer, George Foreman, man, he's one of the greatest to ever do it. And I'll make my argument in a little bit. Also, my daughter, George Foreman is one of her favorite fighters of all time too. Now, if you don't believe me, I'm gonna go back into the archives of cute little daughter, and I'm gonna roll that right now.
Who's that on Daddy's shirt?
That's my name.
Do you like George Foreman?
This one is my favorite.
As you can see from my daughter's reaction, we love George Foreman in this household. So I want to make that perfectly clear that we are tremendous George Foreman fans, but I got a few points of contention to bring up on his list. So let's take a look. Some of the things that I praise Foreman's list for. First of all, taking a look at both of our lists, we shared 6 out of the 10 fighters on our list. And to be honest, it should be 7. And I'll talk about that later too. We both rank Joe Louis and the great Rocky Marciano very highly on our list. That's great. And looking at a lot of the other fighters, we have very similar rankings for many of those fighters. So there are differences, but they're not like polar opposite differences. They're subtle differences, but there are differences. So let's take a look at them. First point of contention I had with George Foreman's all-time heavyweight list. He had John L. Sullivan 3. I didn't have John L. Sullivan on my list at all, and I'll tell you why. You take a look at John L. Sullivan, first American heavyweight champion of the world, and at first glance, his record looks fantastic, 38-1-1 with 32 KOs. Here's where I have a problem with John L. Sullivan. because he was the first and he was so early to do it, the level of competition wasn't there. Yes, people have been fighting with bare knuckles for a long time throughout history, but that doesn't mean that they were great fighters by any stretch of the imagination. And often they weren't world-class fighters. If you go through John L. Sullivan's list of competitors, there's not a whole lot of great people on there. I'm sure boxing historians could do a much deeper dive than I could and tell you the intricacies of some of the opponents of John L. Sullivan's career, but there's no one that really jumps out to me that says, oh my goodness, because you beat this guy, and this guy, you're one of the best of all times. Yes, these guys were the pioneers, but that also means that they didn't know exactly what they were doing. Even though he had a nice looking record, a very nice looking record, I don't think he beat the type of fighters to say that he should be a top 10 great. You could definitely make an argument for Evander Holyfield. His losses to Bo and Lewis, I think, dropped him a little bit from consideration, considering that he was in his prime when he lost to those guys. And there's other losses that he had on his record too that just keep him off the list. Floyd Patterson. Now, this is where I disagree very highly with George Foreman, having Floyd Patterson as a top 10 greatest heavyweight of all time. Maybe top 20. I could see Floyd Patterson being top 20, but that's still a maybe. Top 10, he's not there for me. Good record, 55, 8-1, 40 KOs. However, he had some questionable losses there. He had his 1954 loss as a middleweight to Joey Maxim, and then also the loss to Ingemar Johansson, which he did avenge that loss, so we got to give him credit for that. And yes, he defeated Archie Moore. But other than that, obviously the back-to-back losses to Sonny Liston in the first round go heavily against him. And then what else is there? I think that there's a lack of quality wins on Floyd Patterson's career to say that he belongs in the top 10. I had James J. Jeffries on my list, and I want to qualify that a little bit. He doesn't have one of these really long records that you might be used to seeing on a lot of early fighters' records. Looking at James J. Jeffries, he had a record of 19-1-2, 16 KOs. Doesn't blow your socks off. However, I think that he had some quality wins. You look at his record, he had wins over Peter Jackson, Tom Sharkey, Bob Fitzsimmons, and James J. Corbett. That's a pretty good list right there. Even though Corbett wasn't the greatest heavyweight champion of all time, he still deserves credit for his stylistic inventions, helping push boxing into the modern era. But that's a pretty good list. He stayed retired for 6 years before coming back to fight well past his prime at the age of 35 and losing to Jack Johnson. I mean, 6 years of retirement, that takes a toll on him. Now, here's another issue that I have with George Foreman's list. Where's Gene Tunney? Where is he? He's nowhere. There's no Gene Tunney on his list. I think Gene Tunney is arguably the most underrated heavyweight boxer of all time. And I truly believe that with every fiber of my being. His biography was amazing. I've read many biographies on the fighters that we're talking about right now. And Gene Tunney, I think there was something really special about him, and not a lot of people give him his due. He was ignored largely in his time, kind of this forgotten champion that no one really wanted to give credit to. And because of that, I think throughout history, we've kind of gone forgetting about Gene Tunney and what a great boxer he was. And a pretty good knockout puncher too. He never gets enough credit for being a knockout puncher, but he was a very good knockout puncher. When we talk about Gene Tunney, yeah, he lacks some notable wins on his record, but he beat Jack Dempsey twice. Now people can say, well, he fought a faded Jack Dempsey. They're pretty close in age. It wasn't like we're talking like this huge age gap. We're talking like 1 or 2 years, okay? It was just a couple of years that separated them. It wasn't like it was a 10-year age difference. So I think we need to give Tunney a lot of credit for beating Dempsey. Yeah, maybe Dempsey wasn't as fresh as he was a few years prior, but he still beat a very good Jack Dempsey. Other than Dempsey, he had wins against Battling Levinsky, Harry Greb, and George Carpentier, a lot of those fights were at light heavyweight. So yes, as far as being a pure heavyweight, he doesn't have that star power record. But Harry Greb, I'm fascinated with. Harry Greb sparred with Jack Dempsey and made a fool out of him. I mean, embarrassed Jack Dempsey. From what I heard, he wanted to go in there again with him to try to get some sort of revenge because he was so badly outboxed in their few rounds of sparring. And basically, his manager wouldn't allow it because he didn't want him to get embarrassed again. Harry Greb apparently boxed circles around Jack Dempsey when they sparred. And Gene Tunney took him out. Now, it should also be noted that Harry Greb did beat Gene Tunney in their first fight and is the only loss on Gene Tunney's record. The other two fights that they had, Greb had gone blind in one eye. The other big issue I have with George Foreman is that George Foreman isn't on George Foreman's list, but he deserves to be on there. I had him rated 6th as the 6th best heavyweight of all time, and he's more than deserving of that spot. 76-5, 68 KOs, one of the hardest punchers of all time. When we talk about who's the hardest puncher of all time, and we look at guys like in the modern era, Deontay Wilder, and then we go back and we talk about guys like Ernie Shavers and Ken Norton, George Foreman belongs on that list. He was a heavy puncher. The fact that he took out Joe Frazier twice, both by knockouts, especially that first fight, 6 knockdowns in 2 rounds, had to be stopped. Then he goes and he stops Ken Norton as well in early rounds. I think it was round 2 that he stopped Norton. I mean, Norton and Frazier, those are big wins. And the way that he did it, that really says something about him. So, okay, he loses to Ali, his career stalls. 20 years later, at the age of 45, he comes back and regains the title after 20 years. No one else has done anything like that. George Foreman, top 10 heavyweight of all time, doing stuff that nobody has ever done and probably will never do again. The other big thing that I have a problem with on George's list is the placement of Muhammad Ali. I don't think he gives the fighters of his era, including himself, enough credit. I think he fought during the best era of heavyweight boxers. The 60s and early 70s heavyweight scene, the best in history, and George Foreman is part of the reason for that. But Muhammad Ali is the greatest for a reason. When we take a look at Ali, he has Ali 5th. I have Ali 1st. And everyone could debate, what would happen if Joe Louis fought Ali. I think Ali's movement, especially early Ali's movement, gives fighters fits. If he could move the way he moved against Liston and punch as hard as he punched against Liston, he beats everybody right there. But if we're also, talking about Ali's greatness, 2 wins against Liston, both knockouts, a knockout win against Foreman, multiple wins against Floyd Patterson, multiple wins against Joe Frazier, multiple wins against Ken Norton. That right there cements him as number 1 in my book. Now, my faults. I had some issues that a year later, a year removed from my own list, I can look back and say, you made a mistake. And here's my number 1 mistake. I should have had Jack Johnson on my list. That was a big screw up on my part. And the only reason I didn't have Jack Johnson on my list, ignorance. I didn't know enough about Jack Johnson or about the history of the time. Historical context plays a big part in this. I think I incorrectly evaluated his career. Looking at Jack Johnson's record, it doesn't look great. 54, 11, and 7, 34 KOs, and that's a 45% knockout rating. And I think when I looked at that, I saw the lack of knockouts, and I equated that to a lesser heavyweight. I saw the 11 losses on his record, lesser heavyweight. I didn't really take a deep dive into the history of Jack Johnson and his era. When you really look at the early years of Jack Johnson, and you go into that area where it evolved into his prime, he's got one of the richest records out there as a heavyweight. The names on Jack Johnson's list of opponents that he's defeated, it's one of the best lists that you're going to find out there, which is why I should have rated him and rated him high. Sam McVeigh, okay? If we talk about early 1900s boxers, obviously in the United States, prejudice, segregation, racism was rampant. Black boxers were segregated, weren't allowed to fight white fighters for the title. They were barred from fighting for the world heavyweight title. Jack Johnson was the first black heavyweight champion of the world. That era, there were a lot of great black fighters that just never got a shot and could have been world champions had they been given a fair shake. So when we talk about some of those fighters, Sam McVeigh is one of those fighters that could have been a world champion. Jack Johnson beat Sam McVeigh 4 times. Joe Jeanette, another guy that could have been a heavyweight world champion. He beat Joe Jeanette 5 times. Young Peter Jackson, very good heavyweight. Sam Langford, everyone agrees, is one of the best fighters of all time. He only fought him once, and he beat him once. He also beat Stanley Ketchel, James J. Jeffries. Yes, a faded James J. Jeffries, but still James J. Jeffries, Bob Fitzsimmons, and Tommy Burns. Once I really went into the history of Jack Johnson, that's where I gained an appreciation for him. That's where I said I should have ranked him. So here's a redraft of my list. I have Muhammad Ali 1, Joe Louis 2, Rocky Marciano 3, Gene Tunney 4, Jack Johnson 5, George Foreman 6, James J. Jeffries 7, Lennox Lewis 8, Jack Dempsey 9, Mike Tyson 10. Yes, someone had to go if I put Jack Johnson on my list, and the person that had to go was Joe Frazier. Still one of the best fighters of all time, but I took him off my top 10 list. I reevaluated Frazier's placing on my list, and I think ultimately, other than Ali and a handful of other fighters, that he didn't quite have the notable wins. Other than Ali, he had, good wins for the time, the Jerry Quarries, the Jimmy Ellises, those type of fighters. But other than that, he didn't really have any commanding wins. Just beating Ali one time doesn't mean that you make the all-time list. So I had to take him off. So that's my final revamped list after critiquing George Foreman's list and my own. George, if you're out there and you're watching, thank you for sharing your list, and I had a fun time debating your list. Don't forget, fight fans, before you go, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. I have my Twitter and Instagram on the bottom as well. So please take a look, visit, and keep rocking out. If you've got comments, if you agree, if you disagree, if you love my list, if you hate my list, if you want to see something else, give me comments down below. Let me know. Thank you for watching. That's all for now.